Worcester. Riana Honorach, agus a dínúisiil go léir, géal is gaul, is mór an pléisiúr agus an priviléid é Dan Mulhall an cóilta Parnellach sa bliain seo, agus an céad tailóir chun a pósta chealbhú a chuireann á láthair. D'imrí Dan a rinn gnóthaí eachtracha le breis agus 10 bliain, in arm a chum sí round páirtíocht san idir tíocht de comhain tú éine an chéasta, agus bhuaigh lena dhíomha le post mar ambassador in London, le LinkedIn pistad luistán Brexit, agus i Washington nuair a bhí Donald Trump fós a gceannas, agus le linn ar an taithrú níos sona de Joe Biden. Master, honoured guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure and a privilege to introduce Dan Mulhall, this year's Parnell Fellow. He's the first diplomat who's held the post since the fellowship was created 30 years ago, and he served with distinction for more than 40 years in the Irish diplomatic service. He was part of the team that delivered the Good Friday Agreement, and his career culminated in the difficult period of the Brexit car crash, and then in Washington, first while Donald Trump was in charge, and then happily the transition to Joe Biden. Dan trained as a historian in the University College of Cork, as it happens, where he sat at the feet of the first Parnell Fellow, Professor Joe Lee. And throughout his diplomatic career, he's kept his academic interests alive and active, focusing on the relationship between literature and history. A year ago, he published a very well-received Reader's Guide to Joyce's Ulysses, and he's using his time as Parnell Fellow to write a book on Yeats and Ireland. But in tonight's lecture, he's going to be drawing on his own recent diplomatic experience, no doubt with Joe Biden in mind, on the significance of the Irish in America for the recent history of the island itself. So without more ado, I'd invite Dan to give his 2023 Parnell lecture.
Éimean go míle mágad is ucht an cure teacht an seo chun bliain a chahabh an seo go láiste Magdalene, Magdalene, agus go mágad freisin as ucht an ráta sin mar an tréimhse cá mé sa Stáit Aontaithe agus sa Bhreatain i ré dahadagus cethar bliana mar tailor Sarangan Octaga Malaclia. So thank you very much, Eamon, for first of all, I want to thank the Magdalene College and the College's Masters, Christopher Greenwood, for generously hosting me here this year as Parnell Fellow and for making me and Greta very welcome indeed at this college. Special thanks go to Professor Eamon Duffy, who has presided over the Parnell Fellowship from the very beginning, 30 years ago. Eamon has been hugely hospitable to us from the outset. From the day of our arrival, we dined with Eamon, and we have come to treasure his friendship and that of his wife, Jenny. I'm delighted to have my daughter, Tara, and my son, Jason, and Jason's wife, Julia, with us here this evening, together with friends who have travelled from London. I want to extend a very special welcome to Rick Chesley, the managing partner of DLA Piper, the global law firm with which I'm associated, and to Joe Finnerty from the firm, who have both flown from the USA to be here with us this evening. And of course, I'm delighted to have my former colleagues from the Embassy in London in attendance, led by my good friend Michael Lonergan, the Deputy Head of Mission, who worked with me in Edinburgh and Washington. Michael has often said that he taught me all I know about diplomacy, Now that I've retired, I've forgotten all of that, so I can just freewheel from now on without any burden of knowledge imparted to me by Michael and others. I also want to thank Molly MacDonald, who's actually not here this evening. She meant to come, but she couldn't make it at the end. It was my research assistant and a master's student at New York University, whose work I supervised, and she worked on the growth of Irish-American political influence, and this helped me to fill in the gaps in my memory, and the gaps in my memory become all the more apparent as time goes by, I have to confess. I want to also thank Ted Smith of Glucksman Ireland House at NYU for his suggestions and his support. So, to explain the title I've chosen for this lecture, I need to go back to a time before Charles Stewart Parnell came here to Magdalene College as a student in 1865. And I want to quote from an editorial that appeared in the late 1850s in the Times of London newspaper. A paper, by the way, that was not known in the 19th century for its admiration for Ireland or the Irish, quite the opposite. True to the self-confident, boosterish qualities of leader writers everywhere, the Times editor drew the following conclusions about the political impact of Irish emigration to the United States. And I quote, it's the longest quote, but bear with me. If this goes on, the United States will become very Irish. So in Ireland there will be, but on a colossal scale and in a new world. We shall only have pushed the Celt westwards. Then, no longer cooped up between the Liffey and the Shannon, he will spread from New York to San Francisco and keep up the ancient feud at an unforeseen advantage. We must gird our loins to encounter the nemesis of 7 centuries of misgovernment. To the end of time, 100 million spread over the largest habitable area in the world and confronting us everywhere by sea and land will remember that their forefathers paid tithe to the Protestant clergy, rent to absentee landlords, and a forced obedience to the laws which these had made. You have to admire these Victorian editorial writers for their vim and vigor, do you not? So I owe this quotation to President Michael D. Higgins, who used it in a speech he delivered to an Irish-American society of Nassau, Suffolk, and Queens in New York in late September 2019, when I accompanied him there during my time as ambassador to the USA. I have to confess that Rita will remember this. As we drove in the motorcade towards the Irish Centre there at Queens, we saw in front of us the largest tricolour you've ever seen. A massive thing. It almost clouded the horizon, almost covered the horizon. And I was thinking, where is that flying? When I got there, we realized it was flying at the top of the highest ladder of the New York Fire Department's fire truck. And we were escorted into the building by the Emerald Society of the Fire Department of New York. As fine a body of men as you will find anywhere in the world. So I have to confess that when I gave Eamon Duffy my title for this lecture, I misremember the words from the Times editorial. I gave him the title, An Unforeseen Consequence. And it's actually an unforeseen advantage. So if any of you were here purely for an unforeseen consequence, maybe you should leave now. But if an unforeseen advantage is okay with you, but I'll try to weave both advantages and consequences into a seamless web in my description of Irish America's emergence as a factor in transatlantic relations. So, Times editorial was written in an era of unparalleled emigration from Ireland, as almost 2 million people crossed the Atlantic in the 20 years between 1840 and 1860. And as the editorial in the Times feared, that outflow of people from Ireland did go on for decades after 1860. My friend and former colleague at New York University, Kevin Kenny, has calculated that there were 4 million immigrants from Ireland to the United States between 1841 and 1900. Sustained migration on such a scale changed America's demographics and transformed Ireland's global profile by giving our small island a diaspora all over the world, but particularly in the United States of America. The presence of such a large Irish diaspora became something of a game changer in Anglo-Irish relations, as it perennially threatened to be an irritant to US-UK relations at a time when the US was becoming an increasingly important international player in the decades prior to the First World War. When Irish independence was being debated in 1921, Winston Churchill evidently had the influence of Irish America in mind when he proclaimed that, quote, Ireland is not a daughter race, she is a parent nation. Parent, that is, to Irish America. My aim this evening is to explore those family ties and their significance for the triangular relationship between Ireland, the UK, and the United States. Now, the Times figure of 100 million turned out to be an exaggeration, but in every other respect, the Times writer was spot on. The United States did become very Irish. By 1900, possibly 20% of the population of the United States was born in Ireland or first-generation Americans. The United States did become very Irish, and from afar, Irish America kept up the ancient feud with Britain. What's more, as the editorial predicted, Irish Americans retained a view of Irish history that had at its heart a perception of themselves as victims of misgovernment from London. So that unforeseen consequence of emigration has worked to Ireland's advantage since the closing days of the 19th century and remains important to this day. I want to focus on the period between 1972 and 2022, but first a little historical sketch, because I'm a historian and we're in a university where the study of history is an important discipline. My first stop on this historical journey fittingly concerns Charles Stewart Parnell. Like many other nationalist figures from the late 19th century, Parnell toured the United States in 1880. His mother, of course, was an American who came over to Ireland to marry Parnell's father. And on the second, and he toured around the US in 1880. He attracted an enthusiastic welcome wherever he went. The congressional historian Michael Murphy sent me a whole file of cuttings about Parnell's visit to the United States. And, you know, he was met at train stations and paraded by the Irish to the hotel and then feted there and met everyone that you could imagine. In fact, when he was in Washington, he went to see the President of the United States, Rutherford Hayes, at the time. And on the 2nd of February, 1880, he became only the 5th non-American to address the US Congress. Extraordinary fact, really. It's quite a feat, considering that Parnell was not an official representative of any foreign state, but rather a dogged opponent of the British government of that day. Parnell's presence at Congress was facilitated by Irish-American members who secured the passage of the necessary resolution to give Parnell the honour of speaking in the Congress at what was called an official reception. They didn't have the joint address to the Houses of Congress at that time. That came later. So the Philadelphia Inquirer wrote that Parnell, as they put it, arraigning the English government in Congress would make, as they put it, quote, the British line roar. Not sure if the line did roar, but anyway, clearly the Inquirer were aware of the fact that this was not going to go down very well in London, that Parnell, this opponent of British policy, would be given this honour and opportunity in the Congress. Parnell took full advantage of his opportunity. In his speech, he encouraged Congress to maintain its interest in Ireland and appealed to late 19th century America's sense of exceptionalism when he commented that, quote, the public opinion and sentiment of a free country like America is entitled to find expression wherever it is seen that the laws of freedom are not observed. You might even regard that as a premonition of Woodrow Wilson's principles formulated decades later about the need to promote the cause of freedom around the world. Parnell also quoted from the British historian James Anthony Froude, who actually wrote a very critical history of Ireland, which not many Irish nationalists are very fond of, though I did myself pick up a copy of Froude's History of the English in Ireland from someone I met in India many years ago, and I still have it in my possession. But Froude wrote that the emigrants went away with rage in their hearts and a longing hope for revenge hereafter with America's help. So you can see that even in the late 19th century, opinion in Britain was beginning to realize that Irish America was going to be a factor in future relations between Britain and the United States, and indeed a complication in the handling by Britain of the Irish issue, the Irish question. When I was ambassador in Washington, I was often asked by European colleagues why it was that the Irish diaspora in the USA was so much more active and supportive of its Irish homeland than any other European ethnicity. Now, I believe that has to do with the circumstances in which the Irish American community was established. Those who left Ireland in the second half of the 19th century felt a sharp sense of grievance at the circumstances of their departure. Immigrants passed that sentiment on to their children and grandchildren, who remained eager to support Irish nationalist causes as part of an ethnic nationalism that was important to them in their lives as immigrants in the United States as they sought to integrate into a new country. I've heard President Biden speak with pride about his Irish Catholic heritage and his memories of his grandfather Finnegan in Scranton, who was the son of Irish immigrants. And indeed, when the President came to our residence in 2019 to launch the Cambridge History of Ireland, he spoke warmly about his grandfather and indeed quoted a nationalist poem written by his great-grandfather. And in fact, I have a photograph here. One of the photographs of, you'll see it there, has demonstrating, Master, the global reach of Magdalene College, because in that photograph with now President Biden, there are 3 Parnell Fellows, Tom Bartlet, Jane Allmeyer, and myself. So there you are. That's one up for Magdalene, I would say, right? So successive waves of arrivals from Ireland refreshed the Irish community and topped up the prevailing sense of resentment at perceived mistreatment at home. On arrival, the Irish were met often with suspicion and hostility. Nativist movements like the so-called Know-Nothings, which emerged strongly in the 1850s and won a lot of political support in America, they sought to place barriers in the way of the newcomers' advancement. This gave the Irish a sense of cohesion and a kind of a siege mentality embedded in their Irish and Catholic heritage, and encouraged them to band together in defense of their interests through organizations like the Ancient Order of Hibernians, which traces its roots back to 1848. To this day, many Americans can pinpoint the townland in Ireland from which their ancestors hailed and are happy to proclaim their Irish American heritage, which of course, you have to remember that Irish American heritage is an American identity. It's not an Irish identity, although it is connected with Ireland to Ireland's advantage. But essentially, Irish Americans, when they say I'm Irish, they mean I'm an Irish American, and it's quite popular in America to be able to proclaim a hybrid identity of that kind. And Irish American identity is particularly valued by people all over the United States, I've found. So the first Parnell Fellow here, Joe Lee, who was my academic mentor in Cork in the 1970s, once wrote that, and I quote, "No America, no New York, no Easter Rising" of 1916. In other words, this was because Irish Americans helped to keep the flame of Irish independence alight during those decades after the Great Famine. Diaspora historian Kevin Kenny of NYU has pointed out that at times New York City rivaled Dublin in, quote, generating leaders, ideas, and money, end quote, for the cause of advanced Irish nationalism. So literally Irish America was a cockpit of revolutionary, radical nationalism in the second half of the 19th century. The Fenian movement, which was the ultimate instigator of the Rising of 1916, was essentially an Irish American phenomenon. Indeed, I have visited the memorial in Buffalo to the Fenian invasion of Canada when they crossed the river into Canada and had some success before they were beaten back. And that, in fact, paved the way for Canada to form a proper federation in order to protect itself against such invasions in the future. So from the late 19th century onwards, British government representatives became acutely aware of the manner in which Irish America was weighing in to push back against British interests in America. Fear of Irish American influence multiplied during the First World War and in its aftermath. Following the execution of the 1916 leaders, the British ambassador in Washington reported that Irish Americans were outraged and had, quote, blood in their eyes when they look our way. I've read some British government papers that were published after World War I as the government tried to tease out the broad lines of a settlement in Ireland. And those papers were fixated on the capacity of the Irish issue to damage Britain's increasingly vital relations with the United States. Irish race conventions were held in the US in 1916, 1918, and 1919 as a show of political force by Irish America, while the Friends of Irish Freedom was established and grew rapidly from 1919 onwards. In his book, America and the Making of an Independent Ireland, Francis Carroll points to the crucial role the American dimension played in persuading the British government to yield, at least in part, to nationalist Ireland's demands in the period after World War I. So, after independence, Irish America continued to be an asset for Ireland, but there weren't many opportunities for Irish America to influence events in Ireland. Irish diplomats sought to generate support for various anti-partition campaigns, but those activities were never going to sway official US opinion, which remained focused on America's relations with Britain, which in the collective mind of the State Department took precedence over sentimental ethnic affections for Ireland. When John F. Kennedy visited Ireland in 1963, he was strongly urged to make no comment about Northern Ireland that might discommode the government in London, which insisted that Northern Ireland was an exclusively domestic matter. Nevertheless, his presidency was a milestone for Irish America in that Kennedy came 100% from the Irish diaspora and gave the diaspora a certain pride and a certain sense of accomplishment, even if it was not always advantageous for Kennedy to play up his heritage. He had to play it down, in fact, in order to push back against the prejudice that was there against the prospect of a Irish Catholic president taking over in the White House. It is striking how much readier President Joe Biden is. You see him there at the Ireland Fund's dinner there last March. It's striking how much more willing, how much more eager Joe Biden is to play up and to emphasize his Irish heritage. When the Troubles broke out in the late 1960s in Northern Ireland, the US administration was, as before, reluctant to have any involvement whatsoever. Jacqueline sought support in the wake of the serious rioting in Belfast and Derry in around 1970, but he was met with a friendly but firm brush-off. The State Department responded to Irish overtures in the following manner, and I quote, "The government of the United States is deeply distressed by the human suffering that has resulted from the recent events in that area. Nevertheless, the government of the United States has no appropriate basis to intervene with regard to the domestic political situation or civil disturbances in other sovereign countries." So you can see no willingness at all to become involved. And indeed, former Irish President Paddy Hillary, who was at that time a foreign minister for Ireland, had a similar experience when he went to Britain in 1969-70, and he was denied a meeting with his counterpart, the Foreign Secretary. He was fobbed off with a Home Office minister who gave his complaints about violence in Northern Ireland fairly short shrift. So you can see how, in the beginning, there's a great reluctance on the part of the British government to entertain any dialogue with Ireland about Northern Ireland, and a great reluctance on the part of the United States to get involved in any way in the affairs of Northern Ireland. So part of the evolution of the situation in Northern Ireland has been the gradual acknowledgement by the government in London of the role of the Irish government with regard to Northern Ireland, and an acceptance by the UK of the sometimes uncomfortable reality to them of persistent US interests in Northern Ireland. The current EU-UK negotiations have drawn attention to the European Union's interest in Northern Ireland, brought about by the Brexit process on account of its implications for Ireland and for the European single market. So you can see that Northern Ireland's issues have, from being entirely domestic, have become internationalized over the last 50 years. So, at the beginning of the conflict in Northern Ireland, Irish America responded in the time-honoured fashion with financial support for what they saw as the age-old struggle of Ireland against Britain. NORAID, which was Northern Aid, which raised money to supply arms to the IRA effectively, was founded in 1970 and became a focal point for Irish American financial support for Sinn Féin. Irish diplomats at the time faced really very difficult time pushing back against NORAID's fundraising activities, which the Irish government strongly opposed. I remember colleagues now retired telling me how they would be abused at Irish American functions in the United States for their unwillingness to be more aggressive in their attitude towards what was happening in Northern Ireland. Some members of Congress gave at least asset support to Sinn Féin, and I can recall visits to Washington as late as the 1990s when we still steered clear of US political figures who were seen as controversial, or had controversial views from the point of view of the Irish government. In other words, too closely aligned with Sinn Féin. The Good Friday Agreement of 1998 fixed that situation by providing a framework that commands near universal support within Irish America. Constructive evolution of Irish American opinion is an important development and a positive one for Ireland, for the UK and the USA, because it's a good thing that Irish Americans now take a constructive and positive view of Northern Ireland, and is no longer doing the things that were done in the 70s and 80s in ways that were very unhelpful. But the corollary, of course, is that Irish Americans feel they have an investment in the peace process in Northern Ireland, which they are determined to protect from what they see as the ravages of Brexit. So in 1972, the Northern Ireland nationalist John Hume borrowed from his local credit union, believe it or not, to travel to Bonn to meet Senator Edward Kennedy. He got a call from Senator Edward Kennedy, and Kennedy asked him would he come to Bonn. Kennedy probably didn't realize that, traveling to Germany in those days for a person on a teacher's salary in Northern Ireland was not a very easy proposition. He had to go to his local credit union to borrow money. But he met with Kennedy, and Kennedy essentially decided that he was going to take his line from John Hume and not from Sinn Féin from then on. So a new era in Irish American involvement with Ireland began. An era of more vigorous political engagement centred on the search for a peaceful settlement to Northern Ireland's divisions. Those efforts paid their first dividend in 1977 when President Carter was persuaded by the so-called Four Horsemen, not Gang of Four, Four Horsemen, Irish-American politicians, Ted Kennedy, Tip O'Neill, Governor Carey of New York, and Daniel Patrick Moynihan. And against the advice of the State Department, President Carter decided to make a groundbreaking presidential statement on Northern Ireland, which he expressed US backing for a form of government that could command cross-community support. The statement pledged to encourage investment in Northern Ireland if the violence could be brought to an end. Now, Carter's statement was fairly anodyne, but by making it, he departed from the long-established practice of the United States of keeping Northern Ireland's situation at arm's length. So after that, the 1970s saw the establishment of the Irish National Caucus, dedicated to lobbying Congress, the ad hoc Congressional Committee on Irish Affairs, and then in 1981, the Friends of Ireland, which played an important part in securing the Anglo-Irish Agreement alongside President Ronald Reagan. So again, there you had a strong activity, a strong activism on the part of Irish America pushing for what became the Anglo-Irish Agreement of 1984. And you had Tip O'Neill, who, although he was on different sides of the political fence from Ronald Reagan, the two of them liked to sit around telling stories and jokes, and this helped to sort of dilute somewhat Ronald Reagan's otherwise forthright support for Mrs. Thatcher. So on Ireland, I think Tip O'Neill managed to sway Reagan's opinion in a direction that was maybe more favourable from the Irish way of looking at things. Now, the Friends of Ireland group still exists. One of its founding members was a young senator from Delaware, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr., still involved, obviously, at the very top of the political tree. I remember attending meetings with Senator Kennedy during the 1990s, and the depth of his commitment to peace in Northern Ireland was very obvious. To this day, if you visit the Edward M. Kennedy Institute in Boston and view his Senate office, which is there, you will see evidence of his pride in the Kennedy family's Irish background. Rita and I once had the privilege of spending a weekend at Hyannisport as a guest of Robert Kennedy's widow, Ethel, and her family. Again, on that occasion, there was unmistakable sense of how important their Irish heritage is to the Kennedy family. And you have to remember that the family's Irish heritage derives from immigrants who left Ireland in the mid-19th century. Former Congressman Joe Kennedy III, who was President Biden's Northern Ireland envoy, is a sixth-generation American. So, this is a very long trail that leads from the immigrants who left in the 19th century to today's Irish Americans. And then, so Irish American lobbying resulted in the Clinton campaign committing its candidate to appointing an envoy to Northern Ireland, which is quite a radically different approach from the one that had been taken by previous presidents and previous administrations. This all came about because of Irish American pressure on Clinton when he was campaigning to be president and during his time in the Oval Office. I remember visiting the White House a number of times during the Clinton presidency, and you'd have to be impressed with the depth of the president's knowledge of the detail of what was happening in Northern Ireland. It appeared as if he was incredibly well briefed, had soaked up his briefing, and could really hold his own with anyone, even with Irish politicians for whom Northern Ireland is a daily obsession. But he was seemingly incredibly well informed. Former Clinton administration officials Sandy Berger and Anthony Lake later revealed that they spent a quarter of their time on Ireland when they were in the National Security Council, which they were supported by 4 or 5 staffers. So there was a real commitment on the part of the Clinton administration. Today's Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, worked with Clinton on Northern Ireland while in the White House. Today, you have Jake Sullivan, an Irish American, Tom Rice, Irish-born official, John McCarthy, an Irish American, and Amanda Stoltz, who spent time in Northern Ireland, who are very knowledgeable on the subject of Northern Ireland. And that's an important thing to remember. People often scoff at Americans, say, what would they know? They know a lot. They really do take a serious interest in what's happening in Northern Ireland. The appointment of George Mitchell as the President's envoy and later as chair of the talks process, which, by the way, was initially opposed by London and by Ulster Unionists, was a masterstroke on Clinton's part. Mitchell contributed enormously to the outcome of the talks. I retain enormous admiration for the senator, who often quips about the advice he was given when he arrived in Belfast, to the effect that politicians in Northern Ireland would travel a long way to say no. Mitchell's virtue was that he refused to take no for an answer. And whenever the talks looked set to run aground, Mitchell's patience and resilience, schooled by long years in the corridors of the Senate, came to the fore. He had that kind of Zen-like ability to take rough treatment and say, well, I'm coming back in 2 weeks' time, I'll see you all here then. And inevitably and invariably that happened. The talks, which looked to be running aground a number of times, were brought back on track by the determination and the energy that Mitchell brought to his task. Now, many times during the talks that led to the Good Friday Agreement of 1998, I remember well, word would go round in the late evening that the White House was on the line. Imagine that. President of the United States, the world's most powerful figure, was picking up the phone in Washington and ringing provincial politicians in Northern Ireland to urge them to make the necessary steps to achieve an agreement. That was the level of the commitment that Clinton and his people had to Northern Ireland and to political progress there. Clinton's Irish heritage was genuine, but distant, and I don't think he would automatically have associated himself with Irish issues were it not for active Irish American support for him and concerted pressure from them for a more active role for the US administration with regard to Northern Ireland. His administration broke with State Department advice and significantly discommoded the British government by giving a visa to Gerry Adams as part of a push to win support for the peace process among members of the Irish Republican movement. Americans on both sides of their increasingly divided political aisle take pride in the success of the Northern Ireland peace process. They see this as a genuine achievement for American foreign policy. They value the role they played in bringing that agreement about. I know that there are those who say that the USA is not mentioned in the Good Friday Agreement, and that's true, and that they have no role in its implementation. Well, that may be the factual situation. America's role is determined by its huge weight as a global player with a comprehensive range of international interests and objectives. When I arrived in Washington in 2017, I expected to find Irish America a waning resource for Ireland. But that expectation was confounded by my experience of engaging with Irish communities all over America. In my early days, I remember the comment being made to me by Irish Americans that they did not know how they could help 20 years after the Good Friday Agreement. Irish America found its voice in the wake of Brexit, their priority being to protect the open border in Ireland. I often heard Congressman Richie Neal, the co-chair of the Congressional Friends of Ireland, speak of his experience visiting Ireland in the 1980s with a delegation led by Speaker Tom Foley, who was stopped when he crossed the border, and the Speaker and his delegation were required to exit the bus while it was searched by armed soldiers. This drove Congressman Neal, who served for 4 years as chairman of the powerful Ways and Means Committee, to do all in his power to preserve the open border. In April 2019, Neal persuaded Speaker Nancy Pelosi to join a congressional delegation on a visit to London, Dublin, Belfast and Derry. The delegation also included Congressmen Boyle, Kildee and Higgins, so you can tell where their heritage might come from. During that visit, Speaker Pelosi was not an Irish American, although she did say to me a number of times, I don't have any Irish grandparents, but I have 2 Irish grandchildren, because her daughter is married to an Irish American and her children have been to Ireland on a regular basis. She once told me a story about her grandchildren giving her this Irish saying. She said, oh, did that come from one of the old mythological sagas? And they said, no, we saw it at Shannon Airport. But anyway, this is why I have Speaker Pelosi up on the screen here quite a lot, because she's become the equivalent of Kathleen Houlihan, I think, for us in the last number of years. So supportive has she been of Ireland's concerns about the border on the island of Ireland. So the Speaker in London said the following, quote, Brexit cannot be allowed to imperil the Good Friday Agreement. The UK must respect the Northern Ireland Protocol as signed with the EU to ensure the free flow of goods across the border. If the UK violates that international treaty and Brexit undermines the Good Friday Accord, there will be absolutely no chance of a US-UK trade agreement passing the Congress. The Good Friday Agreement is treasured by the American people and will be proudly defended in the United States Congress. So it's a pretty strong statement by the Speaker. Now, the Irish government treated the Speaker as if she were on a formal state visit. Her delegation was accommodated by the government at the government guest house in the Phoenix Park. She was seen by the President, the Taoiseach, the Foreign Minister, and the leaders of the opposition parties. There was a state dinner in her honour at Dublin Castle, and she addressed the joint houses of our Parliament. The contrast with her reception in Britain could not have been lost on the Speaker. The Speaker and her delegation also crossed the border between Derry and Donegal and saw how open it is now that customs and security controls are no longer required. So the Speaker, I think in London, her visit was characterised by a meeting she had with a delegation of, shall we say, fervent Brexiteers, I would say. I think it was Jacob Rees-Mogg and Mark Francois and people like that. I wasn't at the meeting, but I gather it didn't go well. The Speaker's remarks, which were repeated again and again in the years that followed, were impactful because of the extent to which Brexit enthusiasts were relying on a US trade deal to make up for losses in UK trade with the EU. One way of looking at Brexit, in my view, is Brexit is an attempt to defy the logic of geography by believing that gains in trade with faraway countries can compensate for losses sustained on Britain's doorstep. It's an attempt to test the proposition whether destiny is shaped more by ideology than geography. Always expect geography to prevail, in my view. Anyway, the Biden administration made clear its preference for a negotiated solution to the issues surrounding the Northern Ireland Protocol. They, of course, will not wish to take sides, but they do not want to see their two closest allies, the UK and the EU, at loggerheads, especially when the overwhelming priority is now to continue with a concerted pushback against the Russian invasion of Ukraine. They have publicly urged the UK to pursue a negotiated settlement, and the administration recently nominated Joe Kennedy as its economic envoy. Kennedy will be at pains to listen to all sides. His role does not relate to the protocol, but to fostering economic links between the US and Northern Ireland, which the smooth operation of the protocol will facilitate. But his appointment highlights the administration's enduring interest in Northern Ireland. I know that there are those who scorn Irish-American involvement in Northern Ireland. That would be a mistake. I have found that Irish-American politicians take a serious interest in Ireland, often following developments on a daily basis through the Irish media. They all have staffers who keep them informed of what's going on in Ireland. Some are undoubtedly better informed, I would say, than many of their British counterparts, for whom Northern Ireland is a small beer. Irish Americans are now solidly supportive of the Good Friday Agreement. While a percentage of them are emotionally committed to the legitimate goal of a united Ireland, all have the preservation of peace in Ireland as their prime goal. The leading Irish American political NGO at present is the Ad Hoc Committee to Protect the Good Friday Agreement. So you can see how from supporting, funding IRA activity in Northern Ireland in the 70s and 80s, Irish Americans are now solidly supportive of the peace process and the Good Friday Agreement. There may be an expectation in this country that a change of administration would benefit Britain by ending Ireland's advantageous relationship with the Biden presidency. It is always a mistake, in my view, to base international relationships on the political weather, which can change in unpredictable ways. Successive Irish governments have sought to cultivate relationships on both sides of the aisle, which has paid off in the form of continued US engagement with Ireland in the annual St. Patrick's Day celebration that has become completely bipartisan, having been embraced by presidents and speakers of all stripes. It will be interesting to see this year the dynamics of the relationship on Patrick's Day between an Irish-American president, Joe Biden, and an Irish-American speaker, Kevin McCarthy, from different parties. Incidentally, the list of Irish-American speakers since 1945 is very impressive. You've had Martin, McCormick, O'Neill, Foley, Ryan, and now McCarthy. So the numbers in Parliament, in Congress, may no longer be what they were in the past, but certainly they've managed to rise to senior positions quite successfully. It is true that interest in Northern Ireland is more instinctive among Democrats, but nonetheless, the Trump administration, while it was inherently sympathetic to the Brexit project, always expressed an understanding of the problems posed by the border in Ireland. One senior Trump official once told me of his hostility, deep hostility to the European Union, but his desire to be helpful in avoiding a hard border on the island of Ireland. So you have this curious mix among the Republicans of being enthusiastic about Brexit, but still wanting to try to secure the gains that were made in 1998 and thereafter as part of the Good Friday Agreement and its legacy. The Good Friday Agreement was a piece that, in W.B. Yeats's words used in a different context, came dropping slow. It took a long time to mature, a lot of failed initiatives before the right time came around. There were many strands that fed into that agreement. There were governments in Dublin and London that were on the same wavelength back in the 1990s about what was needed, what needed to be done to secure a lasting peace in Northern Ireland. And there was also conflict weariness on both sides of the divide in Northern Ireland. The influence of the US was an important contributory factor, I believe, and that was orchestrated by Irish America with encouragement from Irish diplomats and visiting Irish politicians. While US influence was deployed initially in the face of some resistance from the UK, over time the British government became more willing to listen to the voice of the US on Irish issues. I saw a report over the weekend that Prime Minister Sunak plans to call President Biden this week to brief him on the Northern Ireland Protocol, which suggests that the Prime Minister recognises an inescapable US dimension to this issue, which wouldn't have been the case in the past. The story of US involvement in support of peace and reconciliation in Northern Ireland is one in which the interest of a small country, Ireland, came by dint of the skillful deployment of the soft power of its diaspora to get an important hearing in the United States, even when those Irish interests were at variance with the preferences of one of the US's prime allies, the United Kingdom. Now, it would, of course, be completely wrong to exaggerate the unforeseen advantage brought about by the emigration of millions of Irish people to the United States in the 19th century. No US administration is ever likely to damage its relationship with the UK for Irish-related reasons. But that will not stop them from making their opinions felt when it comes to Northern Ireland. While the UK tends to overplay the idea of a special relationship, which you do not hear so much about from Americans, there is no doubt that Britain is a major, probably indispensable ally for the United States. The US and the UK have a comprehensive, multifaceted partnership which includes security, defence and intelligence dimensions, among other things. And this is something that Ireland cannot and will never be able to match. What Ireland can do is have its own rapport with the United States, anchored in the people-to-people links created by immigration and with a substantial added economic dimension in recent decades due to the huge flows of trade and investment between Ireland and the United States in both directions in recent decades. Ireland's advantage in the US is that Irish interests get a positive hearing in the corridors of power in Washington, D.C., where there is considerable support for Ireland's basic aim with regard to Northern Ireland, which is to preserve peace and build on the promise of the Good Friday Agreement through enhanced North-South relations in Ireland and improved ties with our nearest neighbour in Britain. Continuing US dimension with regard to Northern Ireland is a benign legacy of the emigrant Irish who crossed the Atlantic in their millions and became a force in US politics in the affairs of their ancestral homeland and laterally in Ireland's relations with its nearest neighbour through their influence on American opinion and the American administration. Now, if you want to predict the future role of Irish America with regard to Ireland, just look at the long tradition of involvement in Irish affairs stretching back to the mid-19th century and continuing more or less unabated in the generations that followed. I expect that there will be, in the future, strong strands of continuity in Irish-American engagement with Ireland alongside inevitable elements of change. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to answer any question you may have on any subject under the sun. I don't speak for the Irish government, by the way. If you want to have clarification on the Irish policies, talk to Michael Lonergan, a member of the Irish Embassy team. But I'm happy to offer you my own views on any subject that may be of interest to you. Colonel Magdalene.